Support for this episode of Trifles comes from the BSI Press. With the manuscript series, international series, professional series, and more, it's original scholarship you can't miss. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the circle was red, the study was scarlet, and the Scot was glorious, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about the giant rat of Sumatra, the remarkable worm unknown to science, or the repulsive story of the red leech?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 171, Jumping to Conclusions. Well, hello there, and welcome once again to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast, where we talk about some of the itty-bitty, nitty-gritty details in the canon. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you ready to jump with me? Do you trust me?
I am ready to skip to conclusions, happily.
Galloping, skipping.
Yeah, with a spring in my step. Hey, who is that fellow who is so happily skipping to conclusions? And what large government office is he poorly managing?
Well, that could be any number of people. It could.
Yeah. What large institution is he let down lately?
Well, if you would like to support this small institution, there are a variety of ways to do it, partially by leaving us a comment if something touches you. We are at SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. This specific episode is available at ihose.co/Trifles171. We heard from a number of people after the last episode, which was all about uplifting moments, upbeat moments in the canon. And we think that's exactly what the doctor ordered, other than a stiff drink of brandy this time around. You can also send us an email at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. And, of course, our social media channels are open: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. That's where you can find us. And, of course, we are open for business with regard to PayPal and Patreon, where people are helping to make sure that the show production doesn't stop.
Yes, and we should point out that because of the COVID-19 crisis, we are maintaining social distancing, and in fact, I'm staying about 6 feet away from my microphone. But also it means that those Patreon donations need to get bigger because we can't reach the sacks of money. So if you would increase the number of rolls of nickels you send us every month, it will help us maintain a safe distance but also get to the bank.
I like that. And we need to be able to afford to buy those extendo reaches, the grabbers, that will help us get within 6 feet of those.
Yes. And also, as a special treat for you listeners today in today's pandemic world, both Scott and I have taken off our surgical masks to make these recordings.
Well, with that, let's get to today's episode. You know, it is early April, and that means that, well, in normal times, school would be in session. And to me, there's nothing like the adventure of the three students from The Return of Sherlock Holmes that presages the arrival of spring. Of course, there's that famous statement that you see on nearly every Sherlockian menu when we're talking about the vegetable course of the meal, and that is, my dear boy, it is nearly 9, and the landlady babbled of green peas at 7:30. I think that's the only relevant mention of a vegetable in the canon. And chronologists have had a field day with this one. It's there's no single agreed upon date. It flows anywhere from March to May. So clearly it is a springtime adventure, and school is in session. So that's exactly why we wanted to bring it up here in the month of April. And there's a specific kind of trifle, as the show is called, that we would like to address. But first, let's remind people of the setting here, where we find ourselves with respect to Holmes and Watson. This doesn't open in Baker Street, does it, Bert?
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, this is one of those cases where we have some very declarative statements about from Watson, which are very welcome and give us the opportunity, as we usually do, to wonder later whether or not any of it was really true. But he does tell us that it was in the year of 1895, and there was a combination of events. And I just love this. You know, this is Watson starting to tell us a story, and his first report a case, and his first words to us are, now look, this is in the year of 1895. And because of a combination of events, and then his next words, of course, are typical Watson, well, into which I need not enter, which I'm never going to describe to you or even suggest, caused Mr. Sherlock Holmes and myself to spend some weeks in one of our great university towns, which, by the way, I'm not also going to identify. So something really strange happened, and Holmes and I had to spend weeks in one of our great university towns. You figure out which one. And, there was this sort of terrible scandal, and he says we were in furnished lodgings they were very close to a library where Sherlock Holmes was pursuing some laborious researches in early English charters. Now, what could have put us there and put this topic into Sherlock Holmes' hand? Well, I'm never going to tell you.
Right.
But while, if that's not strange enough, all of a sudden, what happened? One of our acquaintances pops up.
So, and this wasn't meant to be the subject of this episode, but the way that is stated, the way Watson opens with, as you say, this enticing bit of information. I won't call them details because they aren't. They're generalizations. But what could it be that actually got them out to a university town for, quote unquote, some weeks? And while he was there, Holmes just happened to be doing some research in the library. And that in itself, Watson won't tell you what brought us out there, but he said he may actually tell us about those English charters because the results were so striking they might be the subject of a future narrative.
Yeah, they really were. Well, I have a suspicion that what it all involved was whether or not the Duke of Westminster really had the leasehold on 221B Baker Street, and Mrs. Hudson was going to be turned down, and that's what But it's kind of it's a bit like, but it's not a particularly terrific analogy. What would happen if you were opening up a Nero Wolfe story by Rex Stout, and Archie said, it was in the year 1965. And for a strange series of circumstances, Wolfe and I were in St. Louis. Here's Holmes is very much rooted in Baker Street, and Watson will go on to tell us that without his scrapbooks and without his chemical table, he's sort of out of sorts. But it is an extraordinary thing that both of them have just sort of up and gone to a college town, not for a day or two, but for weeks to do this sort of research. It's not like what happens with Holmes' physical characteristics and his constitution that could take him to Cornwall for the Devil's Foot case, where he's sort of recuperating some.
Right. And I love that this episode or this story. The manuscript is actually housed at Harvard University at the Houghton Library. This is part of the Speckled Band collection, and I think it's difficult to find many more significant university towns than Cambridge, Massachusetts, home of Harvard. the oldest higher education institution in the United States. So entirely appropriate that it is there. And, I should also say that, it holds a special spot in my heart because I spent my student years and many years thereafter in the Boston area. And to me, that connection between education and that institution or that city is forever one that will remain with me. Well, this mystery is a fascinating one. It's almost like a locked room mystery, but the students are allowed to roam free, and it really becomes, as Holmes says, a 3-card trick. So they figure that it's got to be one of these students that is participating in the Fortescue scholarship competition. The students are required to translate half a page of Greek as part of the exam, and I think it was half a chapter, not half a page, half a chapter of Thucydides, who was, of course, a Greek historian. And what happens is that Mr. Who do we have as the tutor? Hilton Soames leaves the proof out on his desk, leaves his rooms for a bit, and he comes back and he finds that the papers have been disturbed and there's evidence that someone has been in his room. And of course, that's where Holmes and Watson show up, and Holmes looks around inside and out, draws some early conclusions, but then continues on the hunt, questions students, looks into their domiciles as he can, and even goes into town to do some investigation. And the reason we decided to call the title of this episode Jumping to Conclusions is because Holmes says something rather odd after they have visited the stationer in town. Watson and Holmes are reviewing, having visited the 3 students, and he said, the foul-mouthed fellow at the top, the one with the worst record, that's who I would pick. Yet that Indian fellow was sly also. Why should he be pacing his room all the time? Now, there's nothing in that. Many men do it when they are trying to learn something by heart. But he looked at us in a queer way. Well, so would you if a flock of strangers came in on you when you were preparing for an examination the next day, and every moment was of value. No, I see nothing in that. Pencils, too, and knives. All was satisfactory, but that fellow does puzzle me. Who? Why, Bannister, the servant. What's his game in the matter? Well, he impressed me as being a perfectly honest man. So did he me. That's the puzzling part. Why should a perfectly honest man... Well, here's the large stationers. We shall begin our researches here. There were only 4 stationers of any consequences in the town, and at each Holmes produced his pencil chips and bid high for a duplicate. All were agreed that one could be ordered, but that it was not a usual size of pencil, and that it was seldom kept in stock. My friend did not appear to be depressed by his failure, but shrugged his shoulders in a half-humorous resignation. No good, my dear Watson. This, the best and only final clue, has run to nothing. But indeed, I have little doubt we can build up a sufficient case without it. So, the pencil shavings and the findings at the stationer's to Holmes were the best and only final clue. Does that make sense to you in the context of everything else that was gathered?
Well, kind of. The whole thing, it could be that I just have sort of a skeptical and comedically oriented mind, which I suppose I probably do. But the whole prospect of some of the actual performance of some of these activities. I mean, what happens is when Holmes is investigating the scene of this crime, he finds these little tracings, clearly someone has taken out a knife and tried to sharpen a pencil, and clearly whoever copied this information was using a pencil. So he has these little shavings. But the idea that he, and then he finds things. I mean, there's some blue paint on the wooden case of the pencil, so the color of it was blue, and then there are these letters, and this must be the manufacturer, which is Johann Faber. Now, I should say, parenthetically, I'm a big fan of pencils. You and I have talked about pencils, and a fellow named Henry Petrosky, who was a engineering academic, I think at the time at the University of Chicago, wrote a wonderful book years ago that I recommend to everybody called The Pencil, which is just about the pencil. And it turns out that the pencil
what
and
are the odds?
Technology are... Huh?
What are the odds that that's what it would be about?
What are the odds? And it's all about basically why the pencil, the invention of the pencil and the strategic technology of the pencil and pencil making was so important at the time. I mean, this was really a big deal, intellectual property, that even extended into Russia and people like Armand Hammer and so on. Anyway, it's just a real hoot if you're interested in these sort of historical deep dives. But anyway, there's Holmes going into a stationery shop and saying, I say, someone comes up to him and says, "May I help you, sir?" And he says, "Yes, indeed. I have these shavings that I've picked up from the floor, and what I would really like is another one of these pencils." If I was a stationer, I would say, "How's that again, sir? I mean, tell me exactly. I have plenty of blue pencils. Is that what you want?" "Well, no. I'm looking for something exactly like this. Look at these two ends." "Yes, right, sir. Of course." So I just find that to be pretty amusing. But what you have here is a very important thing from the standpoint of the case of the three students. First of all, it's an opportunity for Holmes, when he discovers these things, to bring to Watson's attention a small detail and then to try to wring every possible fact out of it and then to try to chase it down. And luckily, Watson tells us that there were only 4 stationers of any consequence in town, or Holmes could have spent days wandering around. The idea being that if he ever found someone who said, "Oh, yes, I have a tray of these. They're very popular with the people over at the university." And Holmes could have said, "Well, do you happen to remember to whom you sold this important pencil?" And the stationer would have said, "Oh, yes, I know the fellow. He's buying them by the gross." But anyway, what he says here is this: the best and only final clue. And it is I suppose it's the best clue because it's an article. It's evidence of an article with clear characteristics. And now why it's a final clue is kind of a mystery to me. I guess it's the last clue that he could discover in the surround. But he then very accurately says, has run to nothing. And all I can say is thank goodness. But it's kept us occupied and entertained, and we as readers, have puzzled on Johann Faber or Faber and what his pencil might mean, and it would have been very different if Holmes would have encountered some of as he did, later on. I mean, in the case, what he does is he bumps into people and says, "Oh, I say, I've broken my pencil. Can I use one of yours?" or something like that. So he's really, he's trying to find a match to the pencil, clearly. But it is, it doesn't help let's put it this way, it doesn't help in the end to identify the miscreant.
Right. Well, a look at some of the other clues that Holmes had at his disposal right after this quick word from our sponsor. If you check out the BSI Press, you'll find the Manuscript series. That's one of the original series that the BSI Press brought to the public, along with the International series. And in the Manuscript series, you'll find So Painful a Scandal, a facsimile of the original manuscript of the adventure of the 3 students. In it, you'll find notes on the manuscript, a background on the history of the manuscript and its location, as well as scholarship, including 17 problems of the 3 students by Nick Utekin, the 3 students at Cambridge by Guy Marriott, and Frederick Dorr Steele, Sherlock Holmes, and The Three Students by Andrew Malick. If you're interested in digging beyond the surface in any of the original Sherlock Holmes stories, a great place to start is with the BSI manuscript series from the BSI Press. Find them at BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. And we're back talking about jumping to conclusions in The Three Students. Bert, I think you did a marvelous job kind of dissecting why that particular clue about the pencil was important. But, I have to wonder specifically with Johann Faber what the degree of I guess commodity it was. I mean, would it be like someone in a school today finding a chip from a Dixon Ticonderoga number 2 yellow pencil?
Well, in that case, Holmes would have found a whole bunch of them. I mean, it had to be unusual for him to try to find a mate. What I found a little unusual of that is they're beavering around going to the stationer's. Watson says all of the stationers, all were agreed that one could be ordered, but that it was not a usual size and that it was seldom kept in stock.
Right.
Well, my response to that is, so how come the miscreant happened to have one? If it's so bloody unusual.
Right. Well, and, what if they did determine that it had been sold to Gilchrist and they confronted Gilchrist with the proof of the pencil? Couldn't he have said, well, I lent the pencil to Dolat Ross or to Miles McLaren, some of his competitors.
Gilchrist well, poor old Gilchrist, but Gilchrist is a whole other thing. But Gilchrist, would have said, my God, Mr. Holmes, you're a genius. Can you tell me who stole it from my rooms? How you came to know I've been missing this pencil is unbelievable to me, Mr. Holmes.
Well, you think through some of the other clues that Holmes had at his disposal. There was the fresh tear in the leather on the surface of the desk, and there was the presence of the black pyramids of clay or dough that he found there, which he very clearly discovered were in order there, left by some kind of cleat, and were reminiscent of the clay that was found in the jumping pits down at the athletic fields. So, right there, it's pretty clear that a student athlete, was one of the was the one who perpetrated this.
Yeah, it is. Well, when you were talking about this episode as being jumping to conclusions, I thought jumping was a very apt verb to put with it. But this is the sort of case where you can tell what some of these original inputs or suggestions or observations, sort of where they came from. I can imagine that Sir Arthur came home from a round of golf one day with his spiked shoes, and they left little pyramids of turf at the house, and his wife called out to him, "Arthur, take those shoes off." And he said, "I must. These pyramids of clay, I must use that at some point."
Yeah, I think that's a very reasonable supposition. And then, of course, I think the one bit of evidence, aside from the pencil, aside from the bits of clay, that clearly implicated Gilchrist as the perpetrator here, was simply the height of the window. It was very clear that the Indian student and Miles McLaren would be unable to see through the window to determine that there was something on Soames's desk when they passed by. So that alone would have kind of sealed the deal. And to your earlier point, yes, having the other bits of evidence would, kind of put the final nail in the coffin, so to speak. But the final and only clue,
Yeah, best and only final clue.
Only final clue,
It certainly has run to nothing. But two, you do have to feel badly for the perpetrator here at the end of it, because here's someone who has been pursuing an education at this university town, and because of this one weakness, this one lapse in character, what's he decided to do? Well, I'm going to chuck it all. I'm now disgraced. I have to go to another country. I've accepted a commission in the police department in Rhodesia, and I'm out of here.
Yeah.
My goodness.
Yeah. No, I know. I mean, that's worse than Master Jackie Ferguson getting a year at sea for attempted murder.
Yes.
Right? He's cheated and he has to move to an entirely new continent and seek a different kind of life.
Yes. Well, I wonder, there should be some series of mystery stories about Gilchrist, the police inspector in Rhodesia, and the crimes he unravels, and the cold sweat with which he breaks out when someone takes out a particularly blue Johann Faber pencil.
And if he brought on Soames as his assistant, the narrative could be that Gilchrist and Soames, they always clean up.
Yes, Gilchrist and Soames always clean up, and that is certainly a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
You see, my dear Watson, it is not really difficult to construct a series of inferences, each dependent upon its predecessor and each simple in itself. If after doing so one simply knocks out the central inferences and presents one's audience with the starting point and the conclusion,